Thank you, and thank you for inviting me. It's a real treat to be here. This is a little loud, I think. Let's lower that down a bit. Everybody can hear me still just fine? All right, great. So a couple of things quickly. First of all, I know things about stuff, so feel free to ask questions. And again, you guys have already sent in some questions by email. I look forward to answering those during our sort of panel discussion.
Right, we'll be doing a panel format after some intro comments.
Right. Second point is we certainly need more work in this area, so thank you for being here. We're going to need, this is an all hands on deck exercise. Nobody gets a free pass on this. So, and because it is economy-wide, because it is global in nature, there is ultimately money to be made in all this, and so thinking about the engineering and thinking about the entrepreneurship matters. Let me dwell on that for just a second. I learned a couple of things in Washington. One of the things that I learned is that the government is effectively run by lawyers. That's not true in every country, but it is true in our country. One of the things this means is that they actually don't understand a lot of what is material in this space. Their experience has been one where rhetoric wins the day. If you're talking about civil rights, if you're talking about education, if you're talking about civil justice, if you're talking about a lot of where these people are trained and what they do, international affairs and so forth, rhetoric is actually the thing that wins. In energy and environment, it's different. You have physics, you have chemistry, you have engineering, you have cost, you have big active markets. One of the things this means is that they are hungry for input. They really are. They want good feed. And two, it also means they're really reluctant to make policy in the space because they're worried about making bad policy. So actually knowing things about the engineering, knowing things about the finances, knowing things about the market is extremely helpful. Second thing I learned in Washington, this is also very, very important. The United States government does not make policy in other countries. This seems obvious, and yet I'll tell you, I can't tell you the number of conversations I've had where people are like, well, we just got to make China do this. It's like, really? We're just going to make India do this. You know, last time I checked, we had no jurisdiction over India or China or any other country. We can't typically get Canada or Australia to do something, much less other major countries around the world. And so we really have to be clear-eyed about what we're talking about and what's involved. With that, let me start with just a couple of slides. I brought a bunch of presentations and I brought a bunch of slides basically because I didn't know quite what to expect, but this is a good way to start. This is a helpful way to think about it. I just came back from 10 days in Australia talking about a bunch of stuff, and this is one of the talks I gave about the global clean energy mix. My hope today is to do two things. One, separate sense from nonsense, and two, give you guys some good ideas. Beyond that, if I can do those things, then I'll consider myself successful. So let's first of all talk about the actual climate. I won't dwell on this because y'all are come pre-sold. But the bottom line is it's real, it's human, it's man-made, and it's bad. And the more work that gets done on the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, all they say is it keeps getting worse and our understanding is more robust and our uncertainty bands are smaller. But basically, like the central thesis doesn't change. Climate change is largely man-made, it's bad, and it's real. And so we've got heat index of 160 degrees in Iran this past year. That's not good. We've got Zika and malaria and other mosquito-borne pathogens widening their impact zones. That's bad. We've got massive wildfires all around the world. In Indonesia and Australia, this one's from Canada, Fort McMurray, where we've not only had sort of record heat and drought, but also we had pine beetle devastation of the forest, which has trashed that ecosystem. And of course, here in California, we got no water. This is a persistent issue and will continue to be an issue. And water scarce regions have been particularly impacted by this, but there are also more water scarcity in more regions, and those that are water scarce are having more urgency and acuteness around it, so it's a big deal. So this is true. Great. Moving on. This is also true. We've never used less of any kind of energy ever. And in fact, we're going to use an additional 50% more than this over the next 30 to 35 years or so. So by 2050, there's going to be a 40 to 60% projected increase in energy demand. Okay?
Worldwide?
Worldwide, yes. And I'll talk about the US in a minute. And this is also true. You don't get to walk away from this. People are talking about peak consumption happening now. Guess what? That's peak per capita consumption, maybe. And so in point of fact, as long as there's population growth and economic growth, we're going to keep having energy growth for a while still. And I'll show you some other numbers to back this up. This is material because this is what that actually means. It means we're emitting 36 billion tons of carbon dioxide a year today. Let me tell you a couple of things that are relevant around that. One, if all energy growth was met with zero emission energy sources worldwide, we would still be emitting 36 billion tons a year. When you deploy a new nuclear plant or a new renewable plant, you don't actually reduce emissions. You avoid growth. That's important. It's a good thing, but that's not the same thing as reducing emissions. Okay, only 3 things reduce emissions: efficiency and conservation, carbon capture and storage, shutting down plants. That's it. That's the full list. So, this matters. To give you a sense, most people don't really have an understanding of a billion tons. You don't go to the store and buy a billion tons of carrots. So let me tell you what a billion tons is. A billion tons is twice the weight of all the human beings on Earth. We emit 75 times the mass of humanity in the form of carbon dioxide every year. That also means that changing light bulbs ain't going to do it either. You just got to do more. It's a huge, huge, huge difficult task. That doesn't change the work. The fact that it's huge and hard doesn't change the fact that you have to do it, but it gives you a sense of what the job is. Almost everybody who's looked at this seriously comes up with the same conclusion: you need all of the above. All of the above is not a bumper sticker. It's actually the right economics and engineering. Part of the reason why, and this is really simple, and I don't understand why people don't talk about it more frequently, what this is what's called a general equilibrium model. This is from EPRI, but it works for the International Energy Agency. It works for Stanford. The Energy Modeling Forum here at Stanford aggregates all of these models from around the world and looks at them. If you look at each one of these models, there's a very robust finding, and that's that you need all of the above. And the reason why is it's pretty obvious. Some solution will be the cheapest solution in that market. If you take that off the table, you have to replace it with a more expensive option. No mystery, actually. In some market, one answer will be the cheapest thing. In another market, it won't. And so in that context, you need all of the above to do the job. And these are very common numbers. You typically need a big helping of end-use efficiency and demand destruction. That's a kind of a good number. You're always looking at kind of the 40% of the job. Not 100% of the job, but 40% of the job. It's a lot. Nuclear always has a slice. Carbon capture and storage always has a slice. These are kind of typical numbers. Nuclear is sort of 6 to 10%. CCS is typically 12 to 20%. You usually have a bunch of renewables in there, and you usually have some fuel switching. You stop using coal and start using gas. You stop using coal or gas and start using biomass or something else. You do some fuel switching. But this is a pretty good mix. One of the things this means, though, if you take any option off the table, you're committing yourself to more cost for no reason. So, at least one clever person in the world understood this pretty well. And he put this at the center of the climate action plan. And he basically said, we're going to pursue an all-of-the-above strategy for our nation. And that all-of-the-above strategy is going to have 3 primary planks. We're going to reduce emissions, mitigation. Deploy a bunch of clean energy technologies all over the place. 2, adaptation. Climate change is real. We've already done a certain amount of it. It ain't going away anytime soon. We have to harden the infrastructure. We have to build resilience into the system. We have to get on with adaptation, whether we like it or not, because it's real. And the third part is international. He basically said CO2 doesn't stop at our boundaries, doesn't stop at anybody else's boundaries either. We have to have a global confederacy to get this to work. And the good news is he did. And I know a handful of the people who helped pull this off, but we got it. I can't underscore how important Paris is to all of this discussion. I really can't. Paris did 2 things. One, it fundamentally changed the business model of climate negotiations. The previous model for climate negotiations was a circular firing squad. It was everybody pointing guns at each other, okay? Not a great way to build an international accord. Paris was a completely different business model. It was a weight loss club. Everybody said, I'm going to lose 10 pounds. That's what Paris is. We've got good firm targets out of that, 2 degrees and 1.5 degrees. And that's relative to pre-industrial baseline. It's signed after the UN. It's now entered into force as of Friday, I think. On Friday, the Paris Accords enter into full force, thankfully right before Marrakesh, before COP22 starts. It's worth knowing this number's already gone up to, I think, 86 now. This morning, Saudi Arabia signed on. If you don't think that's a big deal, it is. Saudi Arabia is part of a global climate accord. That's good. It's also worth knowing that that's actually not really enough. The fact that it's not quite enough is an understatement. It's not close to enough. First of all, a lot of the goals that were set forth by countries were contingent on funds. They said, we'll do this if the money shows up. So what we actually do is to be determined. Second, if everybody does everything, including the contingent goals, we're not on a 2-degree trajectory. We're on a 2.7-degree trajectory. We're basically shooting to flatten out by the end of the century, maybe a little less. That's a good thing to do. Can't confuse that with 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees. You just can't confuse it with those things. It's also voluntary. So binding and coming into full force for a voluntary accord. We don't actually know what that means. This is still good. One of the things it means is that there's no shelter anywhere. There's no place in the world you can go and imagine that carbon constraints aren't coming your way. It also means that politicians are bound by it. People campaigned on it. People brought it to their countries and said, we have the best plan for our country and we told the world what we're going to do. You can't then say, now we're not going to do it. Because you can't say it's not good for our country. You can't say we didn't make the commitment. So there's a lot of stuff that's really great about this, but it's materially important to understand what this means. Another whack at what this actually means in terms of the math is represented by this. This is BP's number, but again, same thing for the International Energy Agency. Almost anybody who looks at these numbers has very similar numbers. This is what innovation as usual looks like. This is what Paris looks like. This is what a bunch of good policy looks like. It means we're still screwed. I can't be generous about this. If you basically look to 2015, and you look at all of the clean energy growth, we have that, and you look at the reduction in gas and coal and oil, by 2050 our emissions are flat with respect to today, with a bunch of emissions going up in between now and then. What I tell people these days, and you can see it in the slide later if I get to it, if you believe in climate science, believe in climate math. The math is harsh, it's unforgiving, it's arithmetic. It ain't that hard. There's no place to hide. The numbers are true. We emit what we emit and we'll continue to emit unless there's a change. One more stark detail about this is that people have gotten onto the idea that if you're going to hit either a 2-degree target or a 1.5-degree target, represented respectively by the green and the blue bands, you need negative emissions technology. And you don't need a bit of it, you need a bunch of it. By the time that you really need that stuff, say for 1.5 degrees by 2050, you have to be pulling 10 billion tons out of the air every year. That's 20 times the mass of humanity. You have to be pulling out as much out of the air as we are emitting in the whole power sector worldwide today. Harsh, unforgiving numbers. And we don't actually have negative emissions technologies. These things don't exist, really. We'll talk about that later. I'm happy to field that question, but we functionally don't have it. One last word on the math, and then we're going to talk about money for a minute after that. So, the math. Most people don't see it this way. Most people think about this as, we'll just fix power. This is actually where global emissions come from. About a quarter of it comes from power. That's a big chunk. About a quarter of it comes from agriculture and land use. Okay? About a quarter of it comes from industry. Actually, a fifth. A bunch comes from transportation and buildings. It's worth knowing that both of those fractions are growing. But this is the actual math. Now, I said 36 billion tons of CO2. We emit other greenhouse gases, so we actually emit 54 billion tons of equivalent. And we're basically, to make the math easy, I said let's talk 40 gigatons of just the CO2. Forget the other stuff. This is just the CO2 emissions in those points. Now let's say that miraculously, and I do mean miraculously, by 2050, you manage to zero out both power and transportation and buildings. You get all of those to zero somehow. Let me say we're not going to and we don't actually know how to, but let's say that you could. It's not zero. Not only is it not zero, it's not close to zero. It's still 20 billion tons. This ain't easy. It's not the sort of thing you can just declare. It's not the sort of thing that just happens. And this doesn't include non-CO2 greenhouse gases, or the fact that when China and India clean up their air and pull the aerosols out of it, the cooling those aerosols have been providing goes away, right? So a couple of weeks ago, we had the Montreal Protocol. We amended it. We're going to zero out HFCs. That is a huge, big deal. I can't understate how huge a big that deal is. That doesn't change this math, because that math assumed that we were going to get to zero on all that other stuff. It assumed we got to zero on methane. It assumed we got to zero on sulfur hexafluoride. It assumed we got to zero on HFCs and NOx. Okay? This is just the CO2. This is why it's hard, actually. So now let's talk about money. To make it easy, I'm just going to talk about the power sector for a while. Because the power sector are things that kind of people touch. Most people actually don't touch agriculture in their day-to-day. Most people don't touch steel making or cement making in their day-to-day. Most everybody touches power, all right? You don't maybe not see a power plant, but most people know what power plants are. They know what a windmill is, they know what a solar panel is, they know what a gas turbine is. They actually know what these things are. So this is the latest numbers from Lazard. In my money, these are the best numbers, but they're very similar to the numbers, say, that World Resource Institute put out or the Department of Energy put out. These are pretty good numbers, okay? Unlevelized subsidized cost of electricity. 0.1. If you guys have been studying in this class, levelized cost of electricity is a terrible way to talk about this stuff. It's grossly insufficient to task. It's just the best thing that we have to compare apples to apples for real, okay? But it doesn't include things like capacity factor, dispatch, and the value of resilience, and how contracts are made, and it doesn't talk about a bunch of stuff, much less subsidies. But still, this is a good way to think about it. If you're not at least familiar with these numbers, you will fail as an entrepreneur. Promise. You have to actually think about the numbers and what the competitive landscape in the power sector looks like to be serious about this. So a couple of things. First of all, utility scale solar, cheap. This is real. Utility scale solar, cheap. And in fact, keeps getting cheaper. The 2017 numbers are going to be better than the 2016 numbers. There's a couple of points out there in Abu Dhabi and Chile and Mexico where people are putting unsubsidized power purchase agreements in for 3 cents a kilowatt hour. That's awesome. Utility scale solar, cheap. Something else you can see on the same diagram, rooftop solar, not cheap. Rooftop solar, not close to cheap. Actually, rooftop solar, wildly more expensive. Okay, also true. And the ranges there are ranges as a function of technology, a function of solar resource, a function of a number of things, okay? Next thing, wind, cheap. Wind is actually really cheap. We've had 25 years of deployment that's been backed by a whole bunch of subsidies in industry, action, investment, so forth, but it's worked. Wind is competitive basically in a good market where you've got a good wind resource almost anywhere. If you've got onshore wind, great. If you've got offshore wind, not so much. Offshore wind, still pretty expensive actually. Solar thermal, same thing. Solar thermal, something we definitely need, something we definitely want. Today, not really competitive. And in fact, if you don't have the thermal storage in the molten salt, then it's really not competitive. So these are good places to say, hey, let's tuck in, do some research, let's drop the costs. And in fact, the Department of Energy is spending a lot of money trying to get that done, as are other groups around the world. Now, if you look at the other stuff, a couple of things jump out. One, still cheapest option, efficiency. We should always be talking efficiency, for real. It's not free. The costs for efficiency are not zero. A lot of people like to pretend it is, or there's obviously negative costs forever. Like, not really, no. In some cases there are, but in some cases there's market failures or capital expenses you need up front. They're not zero, but it's the cheapest thing you could do, and it's the most effective and efficient on a lot of reasons. The thing that people typically don't talk about is the bottom part of the diagram. First of all, natural gas combined cycle, cheap. Almost everywhere. Intensely competitive. Blows almost all the other technologies out of the water in almost every market. So when you're telling somebody don't burn natural gas, you're saying lose money for a reason I can't defend. That's a problem. If you actually want to reduce emissions, you have to answer that question better. Coal, in some places cheap, in some places not cheap. That's a function of technology, quality of the coal, financial cost, a whole bunch of other kinds of things. But same sort of thing. In some markets, cheap coal will definitely beat cheap solar. That's an issue. Same issue I talked about before. This is part of the reason I do what I do, and you know I'm going to talk about carbon capture and storage, and I will. These are what the costs look like with carbon capture and storage in them. Couple of things. One, in some markets, those will be the cheapest options. Just will be. Not in every market, in some markets. Second point, today the costs are competitive with a bunch of stuff. Today the costs actually beat offshore wind. Today the costs everywhere. They basically beat nuclear almost everywhere. They beat rooftop solar everywhere. It is fair to ask then, why does nobody know what CCS is and why isn't there any deployment? Because these are actually true facts. But that's not represented in the way we think about the market or the way that we talk about the market. And basically the reason why is a policy question. It is what we are valuing and how we're valuing it. And I'm going to spend a certain amount of time talking about that here. Let me skip through a couple of things here quickly. Something that's true is costs are really going down for a lot of the renewables. One of the things that is also true is it's not exactly clear where that ends or how. If you're an entrepreneur, think about this hard. Some people like to look at the upper blue arrow and say, costs are going down, that's great. Kind of true. Some people like to look at the dashed lines and go, costs aren't going down anymore at all. They've kind of flattened out. So we either need a big technology breakthrough or that's the end of that. Other people look at this and go, why are those ranges so big? Is there something we can do to shorten those ranges? All of those things are good questions to ask. One thing that is true about renewables, and I think is sort of part of the reason they've been so successful, is that the pace of innovation in renewables is very fast. And the reason why is because the capital costs for a single solar panel or the capital costs for a single windmill are low. You can build something for a few $100,000 and test it out, try to make it better, and try again. Can't do that for a nuclear plant. Can't do that for a coal plant. Can't do that for CCS. You need $1 billion every time you want to try that. And it's hard to get $1 billion. I've tried. So good things to know, but again, trying to separate sense from nonsense. Yes, the prices are going down. I think they probably will continue to go down. How much? To what end? Not obvious. So thinking about the value proposition in this space, good facts to know. I'm going to stop this part of the presentation here. And I am going to talk just quickly about a couple of things in the CCS space that are relevant, and then I'm going to go over to panel. Jeepers, stuff's hard. Let me blast through a bunch of this stuff, because you've already seen it, and that's the truth. Let me talk about this one. This is what the power market's going to look like in the United States. There's a couple of, this is an analysis done by the Department of Energy. It's one that I like and subscribe to. One of them is the electric cars sell fast, and the other one is the electric cars don't. Basically, the high electricity demand is one in which you have a lot of electric car market penetration. The other one is basically flat, where power demand stays flat kind of for a long time. One of the things that's true in both of these is that you actually get a lot of CCS in both of them. You get a lot of carbon capture and storage. And not just on coal, you also get it on gas. Part of the reason why is because in some markets, CCS on gas is the cheapest option. One of the things that's true about this as well is that the amount of CCS with coal and gas is about the same, and we need a lot of it pretty soon in both of these scenarios. And again, the reason why is because if you don't have it, it costs more in some market. One of the ways I like to explain this to people is in California, you probably won't use CCS. I personally hope we do. I think there's grounds to, and so forth. But we got great solar resources. We've got great wind resources. We're an efficient economy. We've got a lot of support for other kinds of things. Maybe we won't do that here. Compare that with Indiana, Kentucky, Ohio, no solar resource, no wind resource, no geothermal resource, bunches of mine-mouth coal, a lot of natural gas supply in their backyards. For them, it's not the right solution to go to a renewable economy. A lot of people then will say, well, we'll just transmit it in. We'll bring it all from the Dakotas. We'll build these huge transmission lines and bring all the power that we need to, and then we'll back it up with batteries. Well, okay, well, when you back it up with batteries, you triple the capital cost up front. For real, you triple it. That's a lot of money. And the transmission costs money, and you might not build it. Are you really willing to bet the planet on that? I'm not, so I voted with my feet. I spent a lot of my time thinking about CCS and trying to figure out how to make it work in the world. And the good news is that there's a lot of it that does work in the world. This is a plant that's been operating for 20 years in Norway. We've put 20 million tons of carbon dioxide underground there. Here's one in Canada, the Weyburn plant. This was actually from an industrial facility in North Dakota. It's about at 20 million tons as well, about 1.5 million tons a year. The world's first post-combustion retrofit power plant was built in Canada 3 years ago. It's operating just fine, thank you. They're operating at about 1 million tons a year. This is an important thing. They're retrofitting a lignite plant, okay? They're retrofitting a low-rank coal plant with a crappy old boiler. That's what they did here. It was actually their cheapest option in Saskatchewan to zero out their carbon footprint, because Saskatchewan also has no sun, and you can't harness the wind resources because the wind is too strong, actually. It destroys the capital you invest. And there's a whole bunch of industrial plants all over the world, and they're all working just fine at the scale of many millions of tons a year. In fact, the ones that have been built and are operating today put about 28 million tons of carbon dioxide underground, and by the end of the decade, the ones that are under construction will have a total of about 40 million tons a year that are being captured and stored permanently, or I'd say indefinitely. So we know that this works. It's also worth noting that 10 countries list carbon capture and storage as part of their NDCs. It's part of their contribution to the Paris Agreement. And a number of countries, like China, like the United States, like Australia and Canada, don't mention CCS but plan to do it. If you want proof of that, the North American Accord that was signed by Canada, Mexico, and the United States back in June of this year, I think, June of this year, say that they're going to have 50% clean energy power by 2025. Clean energy power includes large hydro, nuclear, and CCS. All three of those countries have said all of the above is what they're going to do. And there's only one of these plants that I want to show you that's relevant, and then I'm going to stop talking. This is a plant that's going to turn on in a couple of weeks. It's actually 100% built, on time and on budget. All-in cost of carbon capture and storage are about $100 a ton, okay? And they've already said they can build a second plant for 70 bucks a ton. All-in costs. Capture, compression, transport, and storage. To give you some sense of comparison, spitballing the wind production tax credit, that's $60 a ton. The Energiewende in Germany is $300 a ton. What we're subsidizing for clean energy in California is about $160 a ton. So these plants are already cheaper than those other things, in the same ballpark. So again, there's a market failure at work here. The fundamental issue here is that there's no way to get your money back if you build one of these plants. I had the good fortune of working with a bunch of bankers and finance people, and people give bankers a hard time. I love bankers because they ask really easy questions. So I come to a bank and I say, I want $1 billion. And they say, we would love to give you $1 billion. First question, how are we going to get our money back? If you can't answer that question, you won't get $1 billion. You won't build a plant. This is about financing. CCS is not too expensive, but you can't finance it today. And part of the reason you can't finance it today, you don't have a clean energy portfolio standard, you have a renewable portfolio standard. So states will mandate a certain amount of renewables, but won't include CCS in that. You have investment and production tax credits for wind and solar not available to geothermal or nuclear or CCS or a whole bunch of other clean energy technologies. Okay? So we've already made some decisions about saying we want to invest in a clean energy enterprise and we want to support it. But as a national policy, while we may talk all of the above and understand all of the above is valuable, most states and Congress are not actually pursuing all of the above for real. What they're saying is we like this. And when you say that, you're basically saying, fine, but just know that you're not actually going to hit your global climate targets, you're not going to create the clean energy economy of the future, and you're not going to actually, you're going to end up spending more money than you need. So with that happy idea, I'm going to stop talking for a bit and transfer back to Leslie to have a conversation.
Well, that was a great and sobering intro. Which chair would you like to be?
I don't care.
Okay. So we're going to run this as a mini panel. Imagine Kate here.
Please do. For those of you who have never met Kate or heard her, she is awesome. I have all the time in the world for Kate, and I'm despondent that she's not able to join us today.
Yeah, this was a true family emergency back east. There was no way around it, and she would love to be here if she could, and maybe we can work out a way to do it later this quarter. She at least said she could write some answers to some of the questions that you've asked. I thought that I would start perhaps on some of the very Kate-specific questions that I had, and you will be our virtual Kate.
I'm your virtual Kate.
Okay.
What can I say?
So what I am asking Julio and Kate are, the risky business reports are clear, well-researched, and alarming. How much attention have they received in government, California and US, and have they been used to help shape policy?
First of all, they've gotten a lot of attention. Not the least reason that you've got Tom Steyer, George Shultz, and Bloomberg writing this, really. They're the ones who put it forward.
Yeah.
And people like to meet with billionaires, and they like to meet with George Shultz, and that's all good. And so these were all taken very, very seriously. I will say that these things are actually taken more seriously in the boardroom than they are taken in state legislatures. The reason why is because boards actually own capital assets. They actually are responsible to their shareholders. They have to make money. So boards of directors take this stuff very, very seriously. It is also fair to then ask, how come they haven't made the investment decisions? Because a lot of boards haven't. First of all, watch this space. I think they're seriously doing it. But second of all, a lot of the decisions that you would like boards to make in terms of investment decisions or research directions or corporate strategy and stuff are still not rewarded in the market, so they won't do it. And until that gets fixed, they are sort of waiting here going, we know exactly what to do when this thing changes. So we're going to wait until this thing changes, and then we know exactly how to make our money after that. But I can't underscore the importance of these reports. They were actually very well received and very influential. And anybody who's serious about this topic has read them and appreciates the value they've provided.
Perfect. And I'm delighted to hear that there's more attention than we would see by looking at the headlines.
Right.
Looking at what, yeah. So I was going to ask, if not, why not? What is getting in the way? And you've answered that very eloquently. What are the proper agencies to make such policy decisions? Because the policies will help the boardrooms make their decisions, right?
So that's actually kind of a tricky question. The right place to make these decisions is not in any agency. The right place to make these decisions is in legislatures. You actually need to pass laws. This has not necessarily worked perfectly everywhere. California is perfectly good at passing laws. They don't always make sense. I like to describe to people that we do a fire, ready, aim in California. And so one example of this was the 1,300 megawatt battery policy. If you call the utilities and say, why are you putting out 1,300 megawatts of storage? They will say, because the legislature told us. I've actually had this conversation with utility CEOs. That is, in fact, the answer they give us. Why 1,300? Why batteries at all? What are you trying to accomplish? It's hard to answer these questions, but we've passed laws. And part of the reason maybe is to create an industry for batteries. Part of the reason is maybe to continue to push down emissions by storing renewable power when it's not going on. But in fact, that renewable mandate says nothing about carbon in it. The battery mandate says nothing about carbon in it. If the goal is to reduce emissions, you should have a law that says something about the emissions, but that's not the way that we do it. The United States Congress is the exact opposite, zero happening. Occasionally you can squeak through an incentive. People like lollipops. I like lollipops. If I had a choice as a legislature, I would always give an incentive before giving a punishment, like a tax or a constraint or something like that. But to be fair, the policies work the same. You can give lots of carrots or lots of sticks. The work doesn't change. The only agencies that actually have authority over this space are basically the air agencies. So the EPA, California Air Resources Board, groups like them have the authority to act in this space. So the question is, what do they do? In California, we're blessed by having Mary Nichols as the as the chairman of the California Air Resources Board. She's awesome, awesome, awesome. And one of the things she knows is that she really wants to reduce pollution, and she doesn't want to do it in a way that's counterproductive. So her team is excellent. They work really, really hard. They're very careful about the rules they make. But when they make a rule, they're confident they're making the right decision, and they're trying to make it work well. And they listen to lots of people, and they take a lot of advice, and they really work it hard. They think hard about the science, the technology, the engineering, the finance. They think about it all, and then they try to make a good rule. In the case of the EPA, first of all, of course, we're whipsawed by national politics. That ain't exactly good. B, the EPA only has so many things it can do. And so they try their best, and what they've come up with, I would say, is not a perfect solution by any means. I think they would accept that, but also say we have to pass something that passes jurisprudence. We also have to do our best to reduce pollution, and we are well within our jurisdiction to do such things. All of those statements are true. They are also open to amending it, and most of their regulations have a process by which every 6 years or 8 years or 10 years they can amend it. And so they gather data. They are a fact-based institution. They gather data, try to understand what the regulation means, and then try to amend it. But in point of fact, you really need legislatures to sort this out.
Okay, great. And then could you describe Kate's work at Next Generation and the Paulson Institute, and what are the continuums of what she's doing and what's changed? Sure.
So a couple of things. First of all, she's the vice president of the Paulson Institute. Paulson Institute's terrific. Started by Hank Paulson. Hank Paulson is actually also one of the risky business partners. Hank was George Bush's Secretary of the Treasury, so he knows things about stuff, especially in the money sector. And in particular, he said, I care about China, and I care about climate. So the Paulson Institute has now, for a long time, been focusing on climate issues and China issues, and China and climate issues. So a certain amount of what Kate is doing there is actually thinking about how to engage in climate issues with the business community and how to affect change in China in a useful way. And again, you can't be cavalier about that. It turns out Hank Paulson and Xi Jinping are two different people, and they have a different brief. But the idea is there is still useful work to do, and a lot of what the Paulson Institute spends its time thinking about is what constitutes useful action. Same thing with NextGen. NextGen is really based on US politics. They're trying to figure out how do we build constituencies, how do we change policies, how do we elect people who will care about these things and so forth. But really that's activism in the United States and advocacy in the United States, but it's still a hard question to answer. What constitutes useful action? NextGen has done better than a lot of groups, actually, in answering that question well and trying to affect change, whether it's through dialogue with state legislators or with corporate boards or with shareholder actions, by helping elect candidates who they think care about climate for real and want to make change, all these other sets of things. They try to cast it in the perspective of risk to children. That's a good thing to do. They try to cast it in the perspective of the human health issues, also a good thing to do. Again, I have a lot of positive things to say about NextGen, and a lot of the reason why both of these groups have been so effective is because Kate remains awesome.
I've got two last Kate questions that are from students, and then perhaps we'll ask for a couple of more Kate questions here, and then Dr. Friedmann can turn back into Julio.
Yes.
So one of them was, according to the Risky Business Report, there's significant financial costs to agriculture, coastal property and infrastructure, and increasing energy prices due to climate change. If this is the case, why don't we see more corporations proposing plans to mitigate the effects or lobbying the government motivated by their fiduciary duty, setting aside humanitarian reasons?
So there's a couple of reasons why that's the case. First of all, like I said, boards are actually taking this seriously. There's a group called CERES. I don't know if you're familiar with them, CERES. They're an environmental advocacy group that basically works with banks and boards. And one of the things that they've done recently was they had a big shareholder vote at Chevron and Exxon, and their request was kind of modest. They said, we want you to explain to us, the shareholders, how you're taking climate change into your long-term financial planning and corporate strategy. The companies that they worked with, Chevron and Exxon, unquestionably have very sophisticated long-term finance and climate strategies. They don't share those with the public. It is reasonable to ask, well, maybe you should share that, and people can go back and forth about that. But that's kind of a good way to affect change. But the reason basically boils down to, well, what's the financial return? Really, that is what the policy decision is about. The policy decision about who gets paid, that's it. And to a lesser extent, how much you get paid. That's what the policy decisions in the energy climate space really are about. And until that happens, a board will look there and say, well, like, why should we be hardening coastal infrastructure? Really? Like, that's the job of a refinery? I don't think so. Mm-hmm. We will harden our refinery because that's an asset that's owned by the shareholders and it generates money for the company.
I'm going to go call the AV.
No. That's just my computer went to sleep. That's it.
Oh.
That's it. Well, we can wake it up if we need to. But yeah, maybe we can make sure that the picture is projecting here. But until that actually happens, there's no reason for them to do such a thing. It is also true, and really true, that corporate boards do not like to go to government and push policy. They really don't. There's two good reasons why they don't like to do that. There's other reasons, but there's two good reasons that they don't want to do that. One of them is that no company wants to build a business model on a government policy. They will be responsive to a government policy, but they really don't want to be sitting here saying, I want to build a business on something that a bunch of guys outside of our company decide on. They would rather let the market do it and be competitive in the market. The second thing about it is people will say, well, how come Exxon and Chevron and these other companies are, Peabody, how come they're not going to government asking for change? The answer to that's pretty obvious. What would happen if you had a whole bunch of fossil energy companies going to Congress and saying, we want you to pass this legislation, whatever it was? They recognize that it's unseemly to actually be asking for anything, to be asking for a level playing field, to be asking for a set of subsidies, any of these other things. So they're actually highly reluctant to do it. Once the law passes, they will be highly responsive and they'll be good corporate citizens in every way. But until that time happens, it is hard for them to decide to go to Congress. One of the useful conversations to have is to say, you should talk to policymakers anyways. You should be proactive in this space. Because you can't afford not to be proactive. The risk your company faces is too great if you're not actually proactive and talk about some policy solutions. But I understand why it's hard for these guys to walk that walk. Mm-hmm.
There's one last, and that is for Kate. If you had the power, but you should answer this too. If you had the power to design and implement the clean energy policy for the next 10 years in the U.S., how would you do it to satisfy the extreme environmentalists and the coal workers?
First of all, that's not the job. The job is not to satisfy these guys. We have a conversation today which is dominated by the ends of the dumbbells, and that's just not helpful. What I would say is instead, what is something that gets the job done that everyone can live with? I actually don't have to make Bill McKibben happy or the CEO of Peabody happy. I don't. But we do have to get emissions down. There's two basic ways to think about the policy. One that is real and will work, and the other which is probably the right way to do it but won't ever happen. That second one is the carbon tax. There's only one country in the world that has a carbon tax. It's Norway. It's a city of 4 million. It's a country of 4 million people with a huge sovereign wealth plan and 98% hydropower. You can't really put a carbon tax into any other country, and it hasn't worked. And the primary reason why is because it automatically it disadvantages you in a bunch of ways. So a lot of people said, well, let's have a global carbon tax. It's like, no, like that's just not going to happen. We tried that for 2 decades and failed. We can't even get a carbon tax in this country. We can't even get a gas tax in this country to fix the roads. I mean, so the idea that we're going to, even though it may be the most economically efficient thing to do, I don't think it's effective because it doesn't exist. A unicorn may be the best mode of transportation, but I'm not going to call one on the phone to get from here to home. So the thing that's effective and the thing that people do is they set emission limits. We don't have a price on sulfur, but we've reduced sulfur emissions in this country by 90%. We had a cap and we ratcheted it down. That's the policy that I personally like. I would not recommend it as a DOE employee. I would not recommend it as a Lawrence Livermore National Security employee because we don't recommend policy. But there are advantages to an emissions standard. One of all, you make it big. 1,100 pounds per megawatt hour, or a comparable thing for the cement and steel industries, make it economy-wide, start it in 15 years. Start it a ways out so everybody has time to develop research, to implement the technologies, to buy the equipment, to figure out their business, to do a bunch of stuff. But make it down, make it big and make it binding, and then ratchet it further. Every 5 years, you drop another 200 pounds per megawatt hour. That would actually make it economy-wide, and it would make it equitable. If you do that, you need to pull away all the other subsidies. You need to pull away, whether it's wind and solar investment production tax credits or land access for mining. You have to sort of get rid of all of it and say, the only thing we care about is down, make it big and make it binding. And the market will respond to that. But if you want to get GE to put $300 million a year into a technology, they need to think the market's there. And if they don't have that signal, they won't put that money into it. You have a question?
You sort of answered it. When you said big, you meant big cut. You didn't mean start high and then come down.
Right. So you actually have to start, I think, below an uncontrolled coal plant. If you don't do that, we're not reducing emissions.
This is a perfect time to ask, are there any more risky business questions before we go a little more general?
Mm-hmm. But I do want to say again, though, I'm not recommending this policy. I'm not. I don't make policy. And in the past, I've had the good fortune to recommend policy to people who do. I've advised members of Congress and all this sort of thing and given my own ideas. But it is outside my purview to recommend policy. I'm not doing it today.
So I think I'll start on you with student questions and then take mine later. Does anybody have a burning question for Dr. Friedmann before I go to the ones that were sent in? Yes.
On the carbon capture and storage that you showed plants that do tens of millions of tons of carbon capture and storage per year. Mm-hmm. But what we need to do is billions, not millions, right? Mm-hmm. Tens of billions.
Right.
And so we're a long way from that. Is most of that carbon capture and storage pumping the CO2 underground? Is that what most of that is?
That is what all of that is. What all of that is. So we're not talking about terrestrial sequestration. We're not talking about biochar. We're not talking about afforestation. We're not talking about any of these things. This is just, there was a smokestack. It was pointing up. Now it's pointing down. That's all we're talking about. So first of all, yes, you're right. We haven't deployed much. 40 million tons a year by 2020 is a good number, but it is not 4 billion. So a couple of thoughts to that. In that context, the deployment for CCS is about where the deployment of solar and wind were 20 years ago, right? Second of all, there's no technical barrier to doing it. So, and in fact, the cost will come down and continue to come down. There are learning curves for renewables of all kinds. There's also learning curves for fossil, and you ultimately work your way down those learning curves through deployment. The other thing that I would say is the International Energy Agency has been very clear about this. To hit a 2050 target, you need 100 times more than we have today. Not 1 million times more, but you do need 100 times more. That is a big number. It is also true that 70% of that is going to be in non-OECD countries, right? So we have to figure out how to do this in a way that those countries would actually adopt and embrace, which is not an easy thing to do either. It is also worth knowing that the International Energy Agency says about half of that deployment will not be in the power sector. It'll actually be heavy industry. It'll be cement, it'll be steel, it'll be glass, it'll be petrochemicals and refining, it'll be fertilizer plants, ethanol plants. These things emit a huge amount of CO2. And these things have very, very few alternatives. Even if you could make a solar smelter, like a solar steel plant, which nobody knows how to do at this point, even if you could, when you make steel, you release carbon dioxide. When you make cement, you release carbon dioxide. It's in the chemistry of the process. So if you're not capturing and storing those emissions, you don't zero out those emissions. So you actually need to do a lot of this in the industrial space as well as in the power sector.
This is a good time to ask one of the student questions. A few weeks ago, Dr. Brent Constance told us that CO2 had essentially no value once captured. How do you think alternatives to CCS that produce useful products compare to classic CCS?
Right. So a couple of things. First of all, that statement is not one I agree with. There's actually a big active commodities business today in CO2 sales. We inject 100 million tons of carbon dioxide underground this year, and it's bought and traded on the open market. It was almost entirely for the purpose of enhanced oil recovery. So if you don't have an oil field that can take the CO2 for enhanced oil recovery, you can't really sell into that market. It's not a global solution, but to say it has no value today is flatly incorrect. Second of all, we choose to value these things or not. There's two bills in front of Congress right now, one in the House and one in the Senate, which would basically create something like a production tax credit for carbon capture and storage. The House version would be $30 a ton. The Senate version would be $35 a ton for enhanced oil recovery and $50 a ton for storage. If that's the case, certainly would not have zero value. At that point, you could go to a bank and say, I'm storing 1 million tons of CO2 a year. That means I will have a $50 million a year revenue stream. And it'll come in the form of this investment tax credit. That is not true today. That is factually correct. But sometime after November 9th, that may actually be true. And these are policy decisions. To say it doesn't have a value is correct, but it's also a policy choice. Third thing is we actually really do need better technologies for CO2 utilization. Right now we have enhanced oil recovery, that's kind of it. We would like to turn CO2 into useful products. Rocks, that works. Cement, that can work. Right now we can turn CO2 into algae. The problem is at the end of the day you've got algae, which isn't exactly a big commodity. You can use it maybe as an animal nutrient, you can use it for fish food, you can use it to maybe upgrade to biofuels someday. All those, the economics of algae are very hard.
Speaking of which, I have to say in a few weeks we're going to have a startup that makes bioproduced sugars using algae. So,
right.
Here,
So
stay tuned.
it's not crazy, but the economics are very, very hard. Turning CO2 into almost anything else is crazy from a thermodynamics perspective, but we still need it. CO2 is spent fuel. Turning it into anything else means you're putting in more energy than you got out of it in the first place. The second law of thermodynamics is a harsh mistress. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. But we're still going to need it. We actually are going to need zero carbon fuels to reduce the footprint in the transportation sector. Because there's some things that are just hard to scrub. It's hard to scrub jet planes. It's hard to scrub trans-Pacific shipping. There are parts of the transportation economy, heavy-duty vehicles are hard to zero out their emissions profile. So we're actually going to need a truly net zero carbon neutral fuel. Maybe that'll be biofuels, maybe not, but we actually need zero carbon drop-in liquid fuels too. A couple of people here at Stanford have put forward the idea that when solar or wind is 2 cents a kilowatt hour, at that point, it makes economic sense to upgrade into fuels. There's a bunch of assumptions baked into that, but it's not crazy to think that. It's also not crazy to think that we might actually live in a world soon that has 2-cent renewables. So there's work to be done, there's entrepreneurship to be had. Don't mistake that though for what the market actually is today. Today in the market, if it costs you $10 a gallon to make a zero carbon footprint fuel, no one will buy that. So you have to work these things through.
So sort of following up on this, economists tell us that we need to price carbon. However, the most successful policies on GHGs to date seem to be subsidies, wind and solar,
Yeah.
ITC, PTC, and mandates, state RPS, federal air pollution requirements. Even in California, the policy that seems to be making a difference is the RPS, not the cap and trade system. How can we make the transition from robust carbon pricing schemes, which our opponents may legitimately label as a hidden overt tax?
Right. In part, I kind of don't care. Again, I'm kind of a policy agnostic. I just want it to work. I want the numbers to go down. I care about tons. If you go to the California legislature and you ask almost anybody there, why are you passing these climate and energy laws? Almost always they will say, because we need to reduce emissions. I've run this experiment. It's true. And they actually really care about greenhouse gas emissions. But like I said before, they don't actually have an emissions contingent in the law. So instead it's percent of market penetration or something like that. Or it's a subsidy for electric vehicles or rooftop solar. It's some other thing with the hope that that will reduce emissions. Part of the reason why is because it's a lot easier to be Santa Claus than to be Dad. And it's a lot easier to get reelected if you're Santa Claus than if you're dad. So when I tell my children you got to clean their rooms, their response is predictable. I tell my kids you got to clean your room, and they say, no, I don't. My room is fine. We did that for 30 years. That's what the past 30 years of climate discussion has been. I don't need to clean my room. This isn't real. Then I say, no, you still got to clean your room. What do my kids do? They go into their room and they play with their favorite toys. That's what we're doing now as a world. It helps. Maybe they'll pick up their favorite toys and put them on the shelf, but you can't confuse that with cleaning your room. At some point or another, clean costs more. Clean costs more for acid rain. Clean costs more for mercury. Clean costs more for particulates. Those were relatively cheap costs compared to not clean. But in point of fact, it costs more. The costs have come down a lot. There's markets around those. There's people who vend these stuff. There's heavy industries around them. That's all good, but clean costs more. You shouldn't expect that there's a zero cost to this. Part of the value of risky business is to say there's a really big cost for not doing this. In the same way that if my kids don't clean their room, there's a big cost. So I don't have a good answer for how to go about this. For real, I don't. But I think it's important to focus on the outcome you care about. And for me, deploying more renewables is a helpful outcome, but not the same thing as reducing tons.
This sort of follows on the same thing. As you may know, Stanford has recently had a fairly strong divest from fossil fuels student movement. Do you believe such movements, and this one in particular, are effective? What's the most effective way for college students to influence climate and energy policy?
To be young. It is not clear to me
We
that
remember well, by the way.
it is not clear to me that a divestment strategy will be effective in this space. There's grounds to believe it might. It is not clear to me that it will be. Part of the reason why is because the investment community has already kind of voted with their feet on a lot of this stuff. They're not investing in new coal mines and new coal builds. They're not investing in heavy oils as much. A lot of groups have already divested from those things. So, and the universities hold on these is relatively small compared to something like CalPERS, which is huge. I think if you want to affect change, there's a few things that are helpful to do. I actually think the strategy that Ceres pursues, the one that I talked about before, is more effective because as a shareholder, you actually have a say into what a company does. So affecting a shareholder action is, I think, a very effective way to go about it. And those shareholder votes, Chevron was 40% of the shareholders said, we want you to show us your climate and energy plan. At Exxon, 38% of the shareholders said it's climate and energy plan. So it is fair to say that they were unsuccessful, but if you're the CEO of Chevron, you listen to that. You really do. And so they're looking at those tea leaves and saying, well, what do we do? How do we figure out what's useful to our shareholders right now? But they have to be responsive to their shareholders. I think that's actually, rather than a divest strategy, I like an invest strategy. Invest in clean energy, invest in policies that help make the transition, invest in companies that you think have a successful business model, invest in companies that currently emit to try to get them to change their practice. I think, again, for the same reason that we like incentives, carrots are better than sticks. If you can provide an incentive to companies and boards to make a better decision, then they will want to do it.
I think I'm going to turn to you folks. Do you have any burning questions here? Super.
For a coal plant, say, if you use CCS, how much does that increase the amount of coal you need per unit of electricity?
There is no easy answer to that question. And let me unpack the many ways in which there's no easy answer to that question. First of all, the way that this is typically calculated is the opposite. It is you use no more coal and derate your power plant. Okay, it turns out that's not the way it's actually done in the world, but that's the way that most of this calculus is done, which is why most of this calculus gets the wrong number compared to what's actually deployed. The numbers that are actually deployed are cheaper. Second of all, it is highly contingent on the quality of the coal, the age of the plant, the heat rate of the boiler, the conversion process, the capture technology, a whole bunch of things. So we always at the Department of Energy present these things as ranges because there are ranges around all these things. Second of all, it actually turns out to be very sensitive to your local geography. In the case of the Boundary Dam plant, there they put in a new boiler that was more efficient to generate and to generate more steam. And they are using more coal, but the amount of extra coal they were using is smaller because they used a better boiler. Okay, but there is more coal that went into that for sure. The all-in cost there are about $127 a ton. So still competitive for a bunch of markets, more than you'd like to pay if you didn't have to. At the Petronova plant, subbituminous coal, higher efficiency project, and the process heat that they're using does not come from coal. It comes from natural gas. They added natural gas supply to provide the process heat, which has a lower carbon footprint and a lower cost. Good business model. So these things end up being, in case in point, very specific to a plant and to an energy type and all these other sorts of things. I also think that it's not really a helpful discussion to say, well, aren't you going to use more coal? As far as I'm concerned, fossil energy is great, except for the greenhouse gas emissions. We've figured out how to zero out everything else.
Coal miners think it's great. Use all you can, right?
Well, but the thing is, I mean, it's cheap, it's ubiquitous, it's easy to transport, it's safe. It is energy storage in a very real way. Out in front of a coal plant, you have 3 months of energy in a pile. And we needed that, actually, for example, during the, what was it, that event a couple of years ago, the winter, we had this massive event in January 2015 where, yeah, the polar vortex. The polar vortex came down. All of the power plants everywhere in North America just turned on and ran all the time. So there ends up being value to these things. So I think it's important to separate the fuel from the emissions. The emissions from fossil energy are pretty bad, actually. If you don't control the sulfur, if you don't control the particulates, if you don't control the mercury, the emissions are pretty awful. That's why most parts of the world don't have Dickensian coal plants anymore. We've actually controlled all those things. And that's pushed some of those to shut. A lot of the coal plant closures in North America have been because of the mercury standards, not because of the carbon standards. And I have no problem with a clean coal plant except for the CO2 emissions. You want those CO2 emissions to get as close to zero as you can. If you can, then that should be clean energy. No clean megawatt left behind. And so if, in fact, you produce more oil or produce more coal, yeah, those have local impacts. Those local impacts are real. Maybe on the safety of the miners, maybe on the beauty of the environment, maybe on the health of the ecosystem. Those are also costs that you should internalize. But there's not necessarily anything inherently bad in any fuel. And I think that's true for nuclear fuel as well. There's nothing inherently bad with nuclear fuel. There's nothing inherently bad with nuclear power. But there are things you got to manage. And if those management issues mean you're not competitive at the end of the day, that's a different story.
I want to ask, what did you learn and what did you teach during your time in Washington? You're very much in favor of taking a turn in government, and would you advise others to do so, and under what circumstances?
Right. So I deeply enjoyed my time in Washington. I really did. And it's not just because it's a fun town, which it is. First of all, I learned an immense amount. There's just no comparison to what you learn inside the tent from outside. You just see things that you wouldn't see otherwise, and you learn things that you wouldn't learn otherwise. So also, second of all, everyone I worked with was awesome, almost to a fault. Very few exceptions to that. One of my favorite examples is the deputy air director for the EPA. Just incredibly hardworking, incredibly knowledgeable, incredibly good at his job. And seeing these people toil, 60-hour weeks, for what's relatively modest pay and just getting punched in the face every day. Joe Goffman is a national treasure, and getting to meet these people and see and work with these people, including the staff that I worked with at the DOE, including the staff I didn't work with at the DOE. These people are awesome, and touching that is terrific. Third, I had the great fortune and the capacity that I had to have a global impact. 2 of the president's budgets had proposed incentives for CCS. They would not have if I wasn't in Washington. It was a team effort. A lot of people put it in, but being there helped make a difference. At one point, somebody came down to the annual Christmas party and told me, we need you to write something up for the president. He's having breakfast with the secretary tomorrow. and he asked a question about CCS. Knowing that that's part of the job was intensely helpful. I was able to represent the US government in India, in China, all over Europe, in Canada, and Mexico, and talk about issues of material importance. And I learned a bunch from that, and I gained incredible respect for the people who I met and worked with, and the need and how they go about their business. And at the end of the day, I just loved it. I hope that if the circumstances are right again, that I have an opportunity to serve again. And make no mistakes, it's service. There are a lot of times where you're like, wow, this thing I have to do is really stupid, and it's going to take a huge amount of time, but I don't get to say no. I'm going to do this because that's what's required. There's a bunch of times where it was like, hey, you thought you were going away this weekend, but you're not. You thought you were sleeping this evening, you're not. But that's, again, part of the nature of service. And I felt really fortunate to have the opportunity to do so, and again, hope under the right circumstances to do so again.
Very cool. The public debate on climate change seems highly polarized and politically driven. Despite the partisanship, are various government agencies willing to collaborate in an effort to combat climate change? Are funding decisions for climate change research generally data-driven, or do politics play a large role?
It will come as a shock to all of you to hear that there's politics in Washington. In fact, this was the only one, I learned one and only one big thing in Washington, D.C., which is that politicians are good at politics. They are good at politics the way that I'm good at geoscience, or Majumdar is good at material science and engineering. It's like they are good at their job. Whether or not you agree with their policies, Harry Reid and Mitch McConnell are not chumps. They are good at what they do. One of the things I learned from this is if you can't tell a story that helps these people get to yes in a political context, nothing happens. So part of the job actually has to be to figure out what matters to these guys. That's important. It's really important. One example of this that I can point to is in 2010, there was a whole bunch of people trying really, really hard to pass a climate bill. There were 2 Senate Democrats who voted against it at the end of the day, so they didn't get to cloture, so it didn't happen. The vote ended up being sort of 58 to 42. And the 2 people who didn't vote were Kent Conrad and Byron Dorgan, who were both Democrats in North Dakota. North Dakota is a state that's 70% Republican. They were the 2 senators from that state, very heavy in fossil energy, in oil and gas and coal. They just couldn't do it politically. And let me also say that if somebody had put a $60,000 ad buy in the Bismarck Tribune, things might have changed. But you have to talk to these guys in a way that is respectful and rational and helpful. If you don't do that, you don't make the progress you need. It is also fair to say that you can do a lot within that context. One of the things that pleased me a great deal is that the Senate staffers really know their business well. The government apparatchiks, the people who are the lifetime civil servants, really know their business well, really well. And they play together pretty nicely, actually. Even when they don't agree, they will sit across from each other at a table and have respectful conversations and try to figure out how to make progress because everybody knows that they want to make progress. Nobody goes to Washington to do nothing. They all went there to make change, to pass laws, to make the world a better place. And so there's an opportunity in talking to them and working with anybody who's there, whether they're a congressional staffer, whether they're some flunky at the White House, whether they are a civil servant at the Department of Treasury. These guys are actually the people who get the work done, and they're really, really good at their jobs, and they know a lot. So I think it's very helpful to be positive and proactive and engage with them, to ask a lot of questions, to go in there with one mouth and 2 ears, and to really try to figure out, to turn your intellect and your experience into something that's helpful to these guys so that they can make helpful policy that keeps the nation going.
Perfect. Any more questions from the audience? Yes?
One small point. You had a table with comparing prices per kilowatt hour for different sources of energy. Obviously, when it comes to nuclear energy, it's sort of hard to put that on that graph because you have an almost infinite fixed cost and a zero marginal cost, right? If an accident happens, the fixed cost next go up to infinity. But I'd like to press you more on the very big and important issue of carbon tax. on the one hand, you seem to have great confidence in the commitments made by these, at Paris, by all these nations, where they, as I see it, they can easily be retracted, presidential orders, whatever, or another party in power, and well, that was not our commitment, it was a previous commitment. You seem to have great confidence in that holding. On the other hand, something that is universal, like a carbon tax, you don't see any place for it, and it seems to be like an admission that we cannot avoid the tragedy of the commons. That basically we cannot price the commons, and an attempt is being made in the state of Washington to pass a carbon tax, and there is disagreement as to whether this is simply another tax in addition to the existing taxes in the Sierra Club wants all kinds of new investments and so forth. It seems that the carbon tax avoids the things that you mentioned, such as subsidy for building a electric power storage, whether or not there's any reduction in CO2, as you said, or a $7,500 rebate on an electric car. If you have something that reflects the true cost of the emissions, and that the whole industry reacted, and not specifically goodies being given out to small groups, that would seem to be more beneficial.
Right. So we have a lot of experience with the carbon tax, and I want to speak to that first and then speak more broadly, and maybe close there. First of all, Kevin Rudd campaigned on a carbon tax in Australia, was elected, passed a carbon tax. His successor, Tony Abbott, undid the carbon tax, campaigned on the same issue. His only issue was, I'm going to come into office, I'm going to remove the carbon tax, which is exactly what he did when he got into office. Second of all, we've just seen a carbon tax appear in Canada. Actually, Justin Trudeau was able to get a whole bunch of people around a table and say, we're going to do a carbon tax. Started small, I think $10 a ton or something like that, but with the desire to ratchet up by 2030 to something substantive. I think the number was about $40 a ton. That sounds useful. Maybe that will hold, maybe it won't. Maybe that will be pulled back. Maybe that will do enough, maybe it won't. Okay, but there's actually an object out there you can point to and say, all right, well, there's at least one carbon tax that came in recently, and it looks like maybe some good things will come from it, because it's the right direction and about the right magnitude, okay? But I want to be clear about this. I don't think there's anything magical about any of these approaches. When I've had this discussion with economists, and once we get past our talking points, we basically both agree. The real issue is, how do you internalize the externality? There's many, many, many different ways to internalize the externality. Economists like an economy-wise tax because it is the least distorting in the market and it's the most efficient. Politicians like it the least because it's the hardest thing to get across the finish line. And it's not that I like one versus the other. The reality is it's very, very hard to get such a thing. Put back again to say that right now there's only 2 countries in the world that have it. So, and if you look at a country like Saudi Arabia, they would never do such a thing, but they have a huge sovereign wealth. Maybe they can use that sovereign wealth to do good things, but they're not going to do it in the form of a carbon tax. As long as they internalize that cost, as long as they spend the money, as long as they reduce their emissions, I don't care. One of the things that's nice about Paris, and let me be clear about this, I don't necessarily have a lot of faith in that Paris will be accomplished either. I laid out my caveats on the screen. I think it's an important event. I think it really matters to have 197 countries acknowledge that climate change is dangerous and that 2 degrees is the limit we should shoot for. That is a huge, huge deal. And the fact that every country had to pony up a plan matters a great deal too. China is not necessarily pursuing a carbon tax, but they do have a carbon market. They will deploy 200,000 megawatts of solar, 200,000 megawatts of wind, 100,000 megawatts of hydro, and 80,000 megawatts of nuclear. That's all good. You know, that's their contribution. None of that's carbon tax, but it will avoid their emissions growth, and it will explore policy options and try a bunch of things. That's part of the genius of Paris. Everybody gets to choose their own way. I am tired of people coming to me and say, my way is the only way that works. Eat your peas. There's 3 ways to lose weight. You can eat less, you can change your diet, and you can exercise. Okay? Eating less is conservation and efficiency. That works. Maybe you could do that with a carbon tax. Maybe you can do that with efficiency standards. Maybe you can do that with some efficiency mandate economy-wide. I don't know how you do it, but that actually loses weight. You can do it by changing your diet. You eat less carbs, you eat more fruit. Wonderful. That's renewables, that's biofuels, that's a whole bunch of other things. You're changing your diet. Okay? That works too. You can exercise. In my mind, that's carbon capture and storage. Same calories, they're just going somewhere else. They're being used for some other purpose. I talk this way because recently I've lost 35 pounds and I'm very pleased with this. And the way that I did it is I did all those things. And I'm still going to the gym because you can't stop going to the gym once you start. Right? So I've eaten less and I've changed my diet and I'm exercising. And guess what? The pounds go off and stay off. But, you know, I don't want anybody telling me what I will eat, how I will exercise, and how I'm going to accomplish my personal health goals. That's my choice. And there's lots of different ways to accomplish it.
Any last burning question here? That's an inspiring note to end on. Thank you so much for being here.